Hello, welcome to our next episode of An Arab and a Jew. Today we're going to talk about whether we think the Palestinian side should be working harder to call out hate speech, expulsionary rhetoric, and genocidal rhetoric when it is making its case. So what I think is, yes, they should. There are a lot of people who claim to support Palestinians, including Palestinians themselves, that do all of these things or any of these things. And it's not what we want for a movement that supports an equitable solution and also greater empowerment. So I'd like to know, Lee, what do you think about that?
Hi, Rebecca. Look, there's an element to this, of course. Hate speech, expulsionary, and genocidal rhetoric should be condemned. There is an element of this that I often wonder about. It should be condemned. Is it understandable in your view? Is there instances where it is understandable?
I think that there are instances where it is understandable, but that does not mean that it is condonable. Like, it is understandable that if you are really, really, really angry, say, to give you another example, that your partner cheated on you, that you kill your partner. That is understandable why you would want to kill your partner, but you're still murdering.
Not acceptable.
It's still not acceptable. You're still a murderer.
Correct. Look, I agree. And I wonder though if speech in itself, I mean, of course, speech can motivate or speech can encourage violent behaviour, but I wonder if it is necessarily responsible for violent behaviour, and I wonder too if hate speech is necessarily as toxic as genocidal rhetoric.
Well, hate speech, of course, is not in the same category as genocidal rhetoric. If you just say something hateful, it is not nearly at the same level as calling for a genocide. Calling for a genocide actually is a subcategory of hate speech, and it is one of the worst, if not the worst, subcategories of hate speech. But that doesn't mean hate speech is good.
No. And look, I mean, we're really talking in the capacity, I guess, of the space that you run, which is unity and strength. None of these lend themselves to the notion of unity. However, I want to go back to this idea. I was reading recently that 60%, if you're a male and you're born Palestinian, there's a 60% chance that you're going to be incarcerated at some point in your life. Sorry, a male Palestinian born in the Israel-Palestine area, you got a 60% chance. Now, if you then decided, well, okay, those odds are much, much smaller if you were an Israeli citizen and a Palestinian, then the odds would have to then be higher because you're averaging it out if you are living in the West Bank, and especially if you excluded Gaza, because nobody certainly from the Israeli forces gets incarcerated from Gaza these days because Israel is not there on the ground to do that. So that would be a pretty high percentage of people in the West Bank, certainly much higher than the 60% average. That would have a chance of being incarcerated if they were born in the West Bank. So would you then suggest that they have no right to hate the people that they feel are oppressing them and possibly unfairly have incarcerated them?
So I think you can call this out without using any of this kind of rhetoric. You can say, this is not right, without using bigoted hate speech or expulsionary or genocidal rhetoric.
Certainly. Do you think the conflict, to a large extent, is emotionally driven rather than rationally driven?
I think it is to a large extent, not completely, but significantly. Like anything that's based on cultural friction is going to be emotionally driven at some level. And people also, when they're talking about what are they doing that relates to their culture, it's often a very visceral reaction. In some people more than others. In relatively few people, is it a relatively rational reaction? And this kind of a movement is led by the masses, not so much by the couple of people who are going to say this doesn't make sense. And so again, culture is important. Cultural diversity is important, but putting thought into how do you respect and protect the cultural diversity, how much do you favor cultural diversity over cultural mixing that has the potential to eliminate some of the diversity. It's a balancing act, but you have to, but you can do this in a way that is thoughtful, that really weighs the pros and cons of each. In engineering, we learn about designing a system. And when you design a system, there are trade-offs. There are pros and cons to everything. And almost any engineering decision you're going to make will have its trade-offs. The question is, what do you want to trade? And the other thing is, if you put in an engineering solution, you often, even after you've solved one bottleneck, you uncover another one. So the point being, it's a long and involving process to work on Israel-Palestine. And no solution is perfect, but one does need to be rational about what are the trade-offs of things.
One of the things that I look at, if I'm talking to an individual, I would promote the idea that you need to have language that that connects with the other side if you really want to make progress. So inflammatory language, however it's posted, is just inflames the conflict and does nothing. And some of the best speakers, especially in this space, that I have a lot of admiration for, are the ones that that can speak rationally and divorce their rhetoric from the emotion of the conflict. Peter Beinart is a great speaker. I absolutely love listening to him talking. And knows how to hold back the emotion. And in fact, not only has the skill to do that for himself, he's got the skill to turn down the heat from the other side as well when somebody else gets inflamed. So that's certainly something to work towards and a skill to try to develop. Some people innately have it, some people don't. But I think on a collective basis, it's really hard as an expectation to say in a group of 5 million people that everybody should be able to have that level of self-control. That I think is unrealistic. I certainly would not expect that from the Jewish side, and I certainly wouldn't expect that from the Palestinian side. I get a lot of people though. I certainly writing on Quora, when I get into discussions with Israelis often Palestinians or Palestine is accused of teaching its kids to hate Israelis or hate Jews specifically from an early age, and I don't buy that. And I think that the hateful rhetoric, certainly any hateful rhetoric, feeds that paradigm, which is not necessarily true. I don't know. I don't know much about the Palestinian education system. I've read reports from human rights groups that condemn both Israeli and Palestinian curriculums in schools, more so the Palestinian one than the Israeli one, but both have got elements of hate speech and racism built into the curriculums. And again, that doesn't do the conflict much good. I certainly am not under any perception that if they tone down the rhetoric, that would end the conflict or create an air of peace or an atmosphere of peace. But it certainly doesn't help. And it feeds the other side, where the very often the Jewish rhetoric is that it's implied, not necessarily stated, that Palestinians are violent by nature, that Islam is anti-Jewish, that Arabs from the dawn of time have had an issue with Jews, and again, the hate speech promotes that. I wonder, though, if I was, and as much as I'd like to be a Peter Beinart, I wonder if I was, an 18-year-old standing at a checkpoint watching my parents being stripped of their dignity by an 18-year-old soldier, if that would not inflame me enough to, and I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it must certainly happen. And I wonder if that wouldn't inflame me enough to maybe have an outburst of hate speech, or even if I was to recount the incident later on, if that wouldn't, and it certainly shapes the way I would view the other side. So if my younger brother was arrested for throwing stones at the age of 8 in the middle of the night by 16 soldiers barging into our house, that sets the tone of how I'm going to view the other side. So it's provocation, I guess, is the point I'm trying to.
Well, it's definitely a point. And so if people don't, well, there's the whole thing. The occupation is being maintained so that the Palestinians are kept from being dangerous. The Palestinians are being dangerous because the occupation is maintained. And so
Yes.
The challenge really is to break that cycle. And it kind of can't quite be done unilaterally by either group. I know there are people on both sides who want to do it unilaterally. It should be done with one side, probably the Israeli side, because it has more power, taking the initiative, but not too desperately. Should be kind of sending a little message. This is by choice, not by fear. And we know what happens when a power just withdraws from another place. This happens time and again. It happened with the European powers who withdrew from MENA, and it created this whole mess in the first place. It happened with the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan. It happened with Israel withdrawing from Gaza. If you just withdraw abruptly, then often a problem government will quickly rush in to fill the gap, as opposed to a planned government that is built to be balanced.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And look, that's always because of its unilateral withdrawal. It's and you know, I wonder had Israel sat down with, let's say, Hamas or a combination government of Hamas and the PA before it withdrew and said, look, this is what we're thinking of doing, but we want to sit down and work out conditions with you, whether that whole Gaza Hamas incident, because again, you know, the blockade perpetuates, the siege on Gaza perpetuates the anger, which causes the rockets to be fired, which causes retaliation by Israel, which creates more anger, and it's self-perpetuating. And, you know, like, again, if you get involved in the discussions, people will say, yeah, but, you know, we didn't elect Hamas, the people did, and, you know, look at their charter, and Hamas are a function of the conflict. They were elected, and they've recently gained strength in popularity because of the conflict. I don't imagine that without the conflict that Hamas would even be in power necessarily.
Well, Israel at one point gave Hamas key levels of support that brought it into power. Now it's lying in the bed that it made for itself. And so Hamas is probably more radical than most of the other major Palestinian political factions on a bunch of things, like it might have the democratic elections, but it does have less liberal social policies, which some Palestinians actually like. And it's also probably on the order of the PFLP in terms of its stance about Israel, but plus genocidal rhetoric. And the PFLP, I believe it is the only major Palestinian political faction that does not have genocidal or expulsionary rhetoric as part of its core mission statement.
Right. Look, I wonder how much. I think a lot of people put too much emphasis on the Hamas charter. Certainly, you know, there's confusion about whether, because in one part it says it accepts a state of Israel along the 67 lines, and another part it says that the whole of Israel-Palestine is Palestine. So there's these conflicting notions in its charter. But by the same token, you could go back to the Likud charter and say, well, the Likud charter specifically says no Palestinian state ever. And so that leaves two-state solution totally out of the question. And if you look at what they've done in the last decade, they've actually lived up to that charter by increasing the amount of settlements and making it almost impossible for a two-state solution to emerge. So putting that much emphasis on the charters of both political parties, or any political party, I think is not the is incongruent to wanting peace. It does nothing to bring the two sides together. You know, certainly it's nothing to ignore, but I think far too much emphasis goes on the idea that that Hamas, certainly on the idea that I very rarely hear people call out the Likud party on the fact that they don't want a two-state solution. In fact, they ignore it. In fact, that's probably why Netanyahu and Obama had a fallout, because Netanyahu just came into office assuming that Obama came into office assuming Netanyahu just wanted a two-state solution, and set about publicly trying to work out the plans for that, until Netanyahu stepped in and said, well, hang on, that's not going to happen. So there's an element of that. I just watched a great movie on Netflix called The Journey, which was about the Northern Ireland conflict. And in the movie, they've I don't know whether this actually happened. It'd be great if it did. But McGuinness and Paisley ended up in a car together on their way to the airport as they were about to begin peace talks. And it was very evident that Paisley was a conservative, far-right, obstinate politician who really didn't even want to be there, never believed there was going to be peace. And McGuinness was the official terrorist that headed up, one of the official terrorists that headed up the IRA, responsible for bombings. And he was the liberal, look, none of this has worked. We really need to make peace here. So I think if they were both going to go on the charters of the IRA and the British Conservatives, there would never have been peace in Ireland. And in fact, if you look at the conflicts where peace has been achieved, it's been remarkably, most of the people prior to the peace being achieved would never have believed it would have happened, whether it was South Africa, whether it was Ireland, even the Tutsis and the Hutus. If you're watching, say, a movie like Hotel Rwanda, where you hear on the radio the Tutsis calling out the Hutus as cockroaches that need to be squashed. It's very reminiscent of the Holocaust, where the Jews where the Germans and Nazis were likening Jews to rats infiltrating a society. This is hate speech at its extreme, and that was certainly a function of South Africa and Northern Ireland. Yet they were still able to achieve a peace, and probably at the height of the conflict, in terms of, at a time when nobody thought it was possible.
Yeah, so the peace treaties that Israel has made historically as well kind of were unpredictable. The one with Egypt, people probably didn't think there was going to be a peace between Israel and Egypt. Let me put it this way. People saw them coming, but it still came a little bit unexpected, basically because they're reflective of larger underlying trends. But at the same time, it's a little bit got an element of randomness. What is the thing that gives these treaties and that extra element of push to actually happen in the sense of being signed and sealed? And so, yes, it is unpredictable. The question does become, how strong a force are the irredentists? So in Israel-Palestine, it does seem that the irredentists were successfully able to sabotage the peace process.
Absolutely. And on both sides, whether it was, I think the Oslo Agreement was certainly doomed the day that Rabin was assassinated. That both in terms of provocation and the Israeli left giving up on a peace process altogether. The outcome, I think, of that was that that Likud sabotaged Oslo for its own benefit. Do you see that when you talk about hate speech, do you see it? So let's break it down. You've got cultural hate speech that, people, let's say in Ramallah, or even I don't see it necessarily, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see it necessarily as a problem with Israeli-Palestinians. I think they're almost fearful of saying anything that would ostracize them within Israel, that might put them on the radar of Shin Bet or Mossad. So I don't necessarily see that it's a problem. In fact, if I'm watching, say, Corey Gill Schuster's Ask Project, anything that could be considered inflammatory usually comes out of Ramallah or the West Bank, certainly not out of Israeli Palestinians. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, they do have different cultural pressures. So there
Yes.
are, for example, very, very, very anti-Zionist political parties in the Knesset that are
Yes.
part of the joint list. So in that sense, they do call out Israel. They do have the freedom to call out Israel. Once you cross the Green Line and you go to a place like Ramallah, there's a very different kind of cultural pressure. They are under the PA and the occupation government.
Yes.
And so
But I would assume that that pressure is to not say anything negative about the existing PA, and it wouldn't be a pressure to not say anything negative about Israel. But that's a reverse pressure in Israel. I think the Palestinians in Israel would feel fairly safe criticizing the PA. Although I've heard a lot of people in East Jerusalem, when they've been interviewed about the recent elections and their ability or inability to vote, were very reluctant to say anything against the PA. Although I imagine a Palestinian living in Tel Aviv would have no issue speaking out against the PA or Hamas, but would be fairly cognizant of speaking out against the Israeli government. And you're right, it's different political pressures.
Yeah, it's different political pressures. There's also, coming as well from the political pressures, there are different cultural pressures. And the truth is that Palestinians in the West Bank, they face checkpoints, they face all these movement restrictions in Gaza too. And a lot of the Palestinians living within the Green Line are related to the ones on the other side of the Green Line. So even if it's not them, they will still have those family ties. So there is, as we found in this past May, a sense of unity among the Palestinian people, even Ra'am, which is very much criticized for its willingness to compromise and work with Israel by a lot of other individuals and groups, still identifies itself as Palestinian, not really as Israeli Arab, which is a label that is sometimes given, especially by Israelis. So even though there are a lot of different factions of Palestinians, there's also an element of unity among them. As there is among Israel, there's a lot of different factions of Israelis, and there's a sense of unity among Israelis.
Yeah, for sure. And look, I think the unit, both sides. I was just thinking that Israeli unity is extremely strong. Jewish Israeli unity is extremely strong. But it is equally as strong with the Palestinians. And you're right. I think the last May highlighted that unity. It's unfortunate that the fulcrum of that unity was Hamas, but that's more a function of the fact that there really is no other. There's no other game in town. So Hamas scored. What they really need, I guess. Look, you could even say they need a Nelson Mandela, but he was designated a terrorist by Western powers when South Africa locked him away for 20 years. So they probably need a Martin Luther King. But again, he was assassinated. So you're going back through history trying to create these parallels that may not necessarily be the right thing.
Well, maybe the one who wasn't assassinated, who didn't really, Gandhi was assassinated. Even Henry David Thoreau, who is really one of the pioneers of nonviolent resistance, who inspired the others, he wasn't going to pay his taxes because his taxes were going to support the Mexican War, which was a war fought by the US, who attacked Mexico purely for territorial expansion on trumped up charges. So Thoreau was not going to pay his taxes to that. He went to jail. These things have consequences. And sometimes these people really can get free enough to get the following. But the Palestinian Nelson Mandela or Gandhi may well be in jail right now.
Yep. Or it could have been someone like Edward Said, who is now dead. It's. I think coordination is what's missing with Palestinians. I don't even necessarily think it's a factor of a split between violent Palestinians and diplomatic Palestinians. I think it's just the fact that they haven't got a leader they can fall behind who is providing an element of hope. But I think, and I'm going to get criticised terribly for saying this, but I think Israel is partly to blame because it has done away with any aspect of hope. I can't see what you could provide Israel with that would bring it to the negotiating table and that could, to any degree, appear fair to Palestinians. They don't want a two-state solution. They don't want to continue peace negotiations. Bennett said that what he wants to do is calm the situation down by not being as tough on Palestinians during the occupation phase. Thank God for small mercies. I don't know what you could possibly offer Israel that might suggest to them they need to change the status quo. That's my big concern, that there is nothing, whether there is hate speech, whether it's genocidal, a lot of this is to provoke change. Even acts of terror historically are ways of promoting political change. Hate speech is just provoking a reaction so that something changes, and hopefully you can then find a back door in that change, because there is no advancement with the status quo. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I do agree that Palestinians are in a rough situation right now. They're seeing expansion and they've gotten a few little pockets, but they're very discontiguous. They're very blockaded, and people are not able to see people that they're close to very easily because of the movement restrictions. And they're not going to like this. And so, it was also very much a disappointment to have the collapse of the peace negotiations. And so they feel that they're at the mercy of someone who they don't trust. They cannot count on that it will make things better for them.
So basically, so I go back to that original point. The door seems to be closed for the emergence of a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King.
Well,
because there's nothing they could say to rally people behind. They can't create a cause that provides hope.
Yes, they can't. Yes, they can't create a cause that provides hope. There seems to be among the Palestinian side an element of almost despair, not quite. Basically, what seems to be giving them hope is the outpouring of pro-Palestinian sentiment worldwide. Now, this is by people who don't really have the power to change what's going on, but they're still getting a lot of support. And the other thing too is different people get different feeds of what they're seeing. So if you look at, say, the Israeli side feed, part of the narrative is Israel strong Israel is safer than it ever was, which statistically it's true. But at the same time, they are acknowledging the increasing prevalence of pro-Palestinian sentiment. And different people have different reactions to it. Some of them, but most of them actually, they kind of want to join it. But at the same time, they see it as playing with fire on their own side. Like even people who
and look, that even extends out into the Western world. You know, like I agree. I think that Palestinians are getting more support than ever from the rest of the world, and I hope that continues to pick up, because I can't see Israel unilaterally deciding that they want to sit down with the Palestinians and provide them with a fair deal. It has to come from pressure from the outside. But I still think that's probably a decade away. If I'm looking back at, say, the South African experience it took in the US, that began in the 50s, and it wasn't really until maybe the late 60s, early 70s before there was real change affected. I see that no different with the Palestinians even, but they do need to continue to gain outside pressure, because they don't have the ability to create a peace process on their own. There's no incentive for Israel to sit down with them and at the negotiating table. And one of the things that I'm noticing more and more, a decade ago, maybe longer, 2 decades ago, the left in Israel, in Israeli society, moved more to the center and probably arguably the center right. And that became the new left. Today, I'm sensing there's this growing nationalism in Israel where it's almost belligerent. Yet Israel is a state only for Jews, and we're proud of it, and nobody has the right to tell us otherwise. I hear that in the discussions on Korah. I see that in things like the basic nation state law. I hear it from Bennett when he was being interviewed, not necessarily now as the PM, but just before he got into power. I hear it from protagonists on Korah, writers on Korah. In fact, saw his last debate with Fleischer. He just about came out and said, "This is not the US. This is not US democracy. We have a right to be a Jewish state and only a Jewish state, and no one else has a right to tell us otherwise." And the only people that understand this idea of equality and would resonate with that notion is Americans. This is not America. That, whether it's true or otherwise, I don't know. I was involved in a discussion recently on Korah with somebody, and their last comment to me was, this is the US in the 19th century. Everybody felt segregation was okay in the 19th century. So don't tell us to move into the 21st century whilst we still have a 19th century culture. It's almost as though there's a sense of pride in that, which bothers me. I'd love to put Israel into a Western democratic category, and Israelis themselves benchmark themselves against theocratic Arab states.
So to start wrapping up right around now.
Yeah.
But this, I would say, is a lot of countries do have an element of segregationism, but I do think that this is an issue that in part it is systemic to Judaism. if you look at many Jewish doctrines, there are a lot of Jewish doctrines that talk about setting yourself apart from the peoples. So I was raised conservative Jewish, which is sort of, by many measures, a middle of the road movement. So the formulation I got of Jewish separatism was basically separate but equal, that there was nothing wrong with people who weren't Jewish, but Judaism was its own distinct world culture. And so it was worth preserving. And even at the expense of some element of separation. Now, there are other Jewish movements that are stricter than mine in a lot of ways. They would be considered to the right of mine, and they do demonize Gentiles. They do talk about how they're separate but better. But movements to the left of mine, the left of the one I grew up with, are going to be not as separatist. But if you look at the demographics of Judaism, even if you go to like the conservative movement has still a relatively low birth rate, high rate of assimilation. And Judaism is becoming dominated by the movements to the right of it, and this ideologically selects for more reactionary Jewish movements. We need to answer the million-dollar question of how do you have a Judaism that is not reactionary? And this is for our own good. And this is for our own good. It is what can keep us healthy, sane, and culturally vital. And this is, yes. So you could almost have a different paradigm with the Palestinians, with that kind of, with a sustainable, non-reactionary Judaism.
So I go back to the original question. Do you think that hate speech is on the Palestinian side is one of the major issues that needs to be tackled at the moment? And if so, what impact will that have on the conflict, if any? My view, as I said, my view is that it is way down the list in terms of needs that need to be addressed for both sides to reach an amicable solution. It's a reaction of the conflict, not the cause of the conflict.
The trouble is, if you take away the conflict, hate speech is going to be, it's entrenched enough that it's likely to be residual. And the other thing too is, so you could probably get away with.
And look, that's been the case that's certainly the case in South Africa. That was the case in the US. That was the experience in the US, I think, right through the 70s. That was probably a very small portion of the German population still felt that after World War II. Certainly, there's a portion of Northern Islanders that would think that. So in every conflict, of course, there's residual, and it takes a generation or two for that to disappear, I think, because it's still fresh. I mean, look, the Holocaust 2 generations later is still effectively in the psyche of the Jewish population around the world, and impacts dramatically on their political and cultural views.
Yes, but the hate speech towards Germans and towards people like Poles who were complicit has definitely come down in my life.
Yes, for sure, for sure, and a good thing. And you would want to make sure it did, I think. But your expectation is not that it would disappear the moment the conflict is over.
No, but the other thing is, it perpetuates the conflict.
Yeah, it does.
It
Absolutely.
perpetuates it. And so you could say hate speech is not the same thing as actual violence, but it does lead to violence. Just like calm speech dampens the conflict,
It gives violence credibility.
It gives violence credibility.
Yeah.
Calm speech dampens the conflict, hate speech inflames it. And so if you could have a community without hate speech, let's do something hypothetical. Let's say to oversimplify things, that the people on the Israeli side want 2 states, the people on the Palestinian side want 1 state. And they can talk about these things without hate speech. So the conflict's got a lot smaller. It's definitely way smaller than it was. But could it still get violent? Yes, but there's also a greater probability that they're going to work it out. They're going to find some way to work it out. Maybe they would compromise between having 2 states and having 1 with something like a federation or a confederation. Maybe they would do what I want to do and start to get non-reactionary Judaism off the ground to try to make 1 state possible from an Israeli side framework. But it would be way less. It would be way less. Hate speech, it doesn't always lead to violence. Sometimes it leads to short of violence. Sometimes it leads to people being canceled.
And certainly, look, it does nothing for the Palestinian cause, and for people sitting on the fence, if Israelis are calling out Palestinians as violent culturally or violent by nature, then their statements gain credibility through Palestinian hate speech. That's my view. I think we both agree that it's understandable. And again, my view is that it's very hard to curb hate speech on an industrial scale where you're talking about 5 million people. It's easy on a one-on-one to educate somebody, but it's pretty disingenuous to say to a 10-year-old kid in school that you can't say anything bad against Israelis while they watch their brother being arrested and their mother being strip searched at a checkpoint. So I don't think you can educate hate speech out of the culture. I think the conflict has to end for that to happen.
Yeah, well, I think that you can tamp down hate, and maybe the easy place is the industrial scale, rather, because some individuals just won't change. But
yes,
once you change the overall tone, you can create a threshold effect. Now, the internet seems to be, to a large extent, doing the opposite, at least relative to what there was before. I mean, it obviously could be worse, but it definitely has gotten worse because people who are more hateful can find their own kind. And,
yes. And look, if you're extreme at either end, you would want the other side, you would want to provoke the other side. You would want your views validated. So whether you're Israeli or whether you're a Palestinian, if you're trying to perpetuate this idea that the other side is by nature violent, then you would want to provoke them into violence just to validate your beliefs.
Yes, and I'm going to make a last concluding statement. I definitely agree that it must not reach the point where violence is validation. It must not go there. That is a certain threshold that must not be crossed.
Agree.
And I guess
always lovely talking to you.
Yes, it's always lovely talking to you. Thank you. And so now it goes off.